Para quien nos acompaña en el stream, estamos empezando este día con Jordan para que nos hable sobre esta construcción poética de los juegos. Now, Jordan, please, go.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Good morning. Buenos dias. It's great to be with you all this morning. Thanks, first of all, very much to Layout Forum for having me here today. My name is Jordan Magnuson, and I'm a longtime experimental game maker. And today I want to talk with you a little bit about the poetics of resonant game design. So what do I mean by this? Well, I mean, as interaction designers, right, how do we craft resonant and impactful game-based experiences, play-based experiences, or video games that tackle things like difficult topics, complex emotions? How do we design interactive encounters that are going to stick with and impact the player? And specifically, I want to share with you an unusual lens I've found to be helpful when it comes to thinking about these questions as a game designer. But before we get started, a little bit more about me. I'm a maker with an interest in interaction design, interactive narrative, digital media art, computational poetry, and video games. And I tend to think of video games as sort of the primary medium that I work with. And video games are what I'm going to be talking about primarily today. But my approach to games is informed by my interest in these other areas, like new media art, computational poetry, and interaction design, broadly speaking. So a little bit about my history with video games. I began messing around making video games in Turbo Pascal when I was 11 or 12, as you can see here. And I ended up starting a couple of little indie games companies during high school and college. And I actually paid for part of my college tuition with shareware funds. So this is back when people would play a demo of your game, then mail you a check to get the full version, long before Steam or Xbox Live Arcade or any of those things. And in 2005, I founded a community site for indie game developers called the Independent Gaming Source, or TIG Source, which was kind of focused on the art house side of game creation, at a time when the indie scene was more focused on casual games, a lot of indie developers at that time. And I was interested in encouraging indie game makers to take more creative risks, to try to tackle new things through game design. And the site was a hopping, popular place for a while, probably best known as the birthplace of a number of classic indie games, games like Minecraft and Fez and Spelunky, and many others. It was sort of the go-to site for indie developers for about 10 years or so. And it felt like pretty much anyone making an innovative indie game was on there for a while. So that was a cool period of time, an interesting period. Anyway, a few years after founding TIGSource, I became particularly interested in experimental and minimalistic game design and using the most basic building blocks of video games to tackle difficult topics, to challenge and push out traditional modes of gameplay, and to explore unexpected themes in unexpected ways. And generally, I got excited about doing just kind of unusual things with video games and interactive media art. So for example, in 2010, during the early days of Kickstarter, I kickstarted a project I called Game Trekking, in which I set out to travel long-term on a very small budget and make little video games along the way about the things I was seeing and experiencing. And the way I thought about this at the time was trying to use video games kind of as a form of travel writing. And that was exciting to me just because I had never seen anyone try to do that before. And I've been making little experimental games ever since, as well as hypertext narratives, and also interactive art installation. And I've been fortunate enough to, this is just kind of blah, 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 some awards and press and books and whatnot that my games have been in. And some of my better known games anyway include Loneliness, Freedom Bridge, The Killer, and the Game Trekking Omnibus, which is the collection of experimental games I made while traveling in Asia. So I'll show you a brief clip from my game Loneliness so you can see the kind of abstract aesthetic that I often work with. So here, let's see if you can. Skip forward a little bit. I'll mute that sound. Anyway, so you get the idea. A game like this is obviously very simple. If we even want to call it a game, abstract interactive experience that attempts to explore a single emotion through the barest possible mechanics. But despite its simplicity, this game resonates strongly enough with some people that I still receive the occasional email of thanks from an anonymous game player. So I've always wondered, why does the game resonate for these players, for the people who find it to be interesting or touching in some way? And let's see if I can get the next slide to come up here. Just a moment. There we go. So this gets back to the topic I want to talk about today, which is how do we craft resonant and impactful video games? And this is something I think a lot about in the context of my own creative practice. So I want to start off here by sharing some of my favorite quotes about games from game designers and industry veterans that I think are relevant to this topic. And I've left off the attributions here to see if anyone maybe recognizes the sources of these quotes, but I'll just share a couple of them with you here. So first one, game design is ordinary language raised to the nth power. Video games are boned with ideas, nerved and blooded with emotions, all held together by the delicate, tough skin of interaction. Here's another quote. The subtlety, elegance, and hunger of the human spirit is obvious everywhere in video games, neither constrained by nor separable from the interactive components, bounding boxes, and digital assets that shelter them. And final quote, video games are what in a game makes you laugh, cry, prickle, be silent, makes your toenails twinkle, makes you want to do this or that or nothing, makes you know that you are alone in the unknown world, that your bliss and suffering is forever shared and forever all your own. So this is a quotation by the poet Dylan Thomas. So actually I lied. I'm sorry, these aren't quotes about video games. They're all quotes about poetry that I have adapted to games. So the unusual lens I want to talk about today that I found to be surprisingly helpful when it comes to designing resonant and impactful interactive experiences is the lens of poetry. And I wanted to start out with these adapted quotes to show part of the reason that I find this lens to be interesting for video games, because I find these adapted quotes to be so strange and intriguing. This idea of a video game that makes you laugh, cry, be silent, or that makes you know that your bliss and suffering is forever shared and forever all your own, right? Or video games about the subtlety, elegance, and hunger of the human spirit, right? Like, wow, I want to play these games. But these quotes also feel kind of strange and alien, right? Like, this is not how we're used to talking about video games. So I want to explore a little bit, is there something here? Can poetry offer us something as interaction designers, as game designers? Can it help us design resonant and impactful interactive experiences? And this is a question I've been pondering for a while based on my own game design practice. And I actually recently published a book on this topic called Game Poems, which is mostly focused on short expressive games. But I think there are lessons in poetry when it comes to designing other kinds of interactive experiences as well, including longer, more traditional video games. And by the way, electronic versions of this book are 100% free, by the way. So if you're interested, you can check them out again at the website I have here, gamepoemsbook.com, and you can read electronic versions completely for free. But before diving into this question of how poetry might help us as game designers, I want to take a moment to consider how we typically tend to think of designing powerful interactive experiences, right? Or to put it another way, if we don't think of video games as being poems, what do we think of them as being, right? What is a video game? What makes a good video game good? And I suggest that there are two main lenses that we tend to apply to video games as game designers and also, well, as game players, first of all, and then also as game designers. And those are the lenses of narrative on the one hand, right? This idea of crafting good stories, and gameplay on the other, right? Or designing fun, balanced game mechanics. So here's a paragraph from a popular game studies textbook, at least one that's popular in the United States, called Understanding Video Games. The authors ask, are video games stories? And they say, yes, we would answer, many video games are stories as well as games. And they go on to flesh that out, right? So this paragraph kind of reflects what I would consider to be a fairly typical kind of progressive view of how stories and gameplay interact in video games, right? Video games can do both, and both are important. But you can certainly find plenty of examples of people who are more on one side or the other, right? Like this intentionally provocative article in The Atlantic a while back stating that video games are better without stories. And that article predictably generated strong reactions, of course, because, of course, for many people, stories are actually the main reason that they play video games, right? And I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because these perspectives are kind of cliched, right? But this debate still crops up in the gaming community and among designers, right? Like, is gameplay or story more important? Is interaction design or narrative design the primary concern for video games? And it kind of highlights how we tend to look at the possibility space of interactive media as players and as designers, as well as the lenses that we use to answer questions like, what makes a video game a video game? What makes a great video game great? And how can we explore meaning in video games? And I think most of us at this point in time realize that good video games can, of course, involve just about any combination of good story and fun gameplay, right? But the thing is, even if that's our perspective, we're still kind of operating on a pretty limited spectrum here between good story and fun gameplay. And I've got some problems with being trapped on this spectrum, which relate to those adapted quotes that I shared and why I think poetry is a useful third point of reference when thinking about designing resonant and impactful interactive media. So problem number one is that my favorite moments in games don't seem to fit into this framework very well. All right, so moments like this from Shadow of the Colossus, one of my all-time favorite games. So I've got these vivid memories of climbing onto this creature that's, bigger than life, holding on with one hand while reaching for my sword with the other, being flung around like a tiny insect on this creature's back, plunging my sword into the creature's head and watching it crumble to the ground and thinking, my God, what have I done, right? Or something quieter here. This is in Brothers, A Tale of Two Sons, another excellent game. Coming across a bench, you can see maybe might be small on the screen, but kind of in the lower left-hand corner there, you can see a bench next to those rocks, right? And realizing that I just want to take a moment and just sit down with my brother and look out at this landscape. Or coming to the end of Limbo and thinking, whoa, there are so many layers of symbolism and meaning here. What is this game about? Right? Or a moment from an older game. I don't know if any of you have played Super Metroid, but in Super Metroid, coming to a save portal, after many save portals, which all work the same way, right? You have to get to the save portal in order to be able to save your game on the original gaming system. And this one simply doesn't work. And I remember thinking, what the hell? Why isn't this working? Then realizing that it doesn't work because I'm in a wrecked ship, right? And the power is cut off. This isn't a revolutionary idea today, but at the time, this is kind of mind-blowing to have the diegetic and non-diegetic worlds of the game and the game's UI come together like this, right? Like not being able to save because the ship is wrecked. Or I remember very vividly a moment towards the end of Eco where I'm on one side of a chasm that starts forming, and Yorda, I'm the player character Eco, right? And Yorda, the non-player character that you're bonding with throughout the game, is on the other side of this chasm that starts forming. And I immediately run and just jump and try to jump across the chasm to get back to Yorda, right? Without knowing or caring if the game is actually going to allow me to make that jump, or if I'm just going to fall to my death and lose all my progress since the last save, right? But in that moment, I'm so invested in these characters that I don't care. Or last example, the first time, this moment from the first time I played Passage, which is just a tiny little memento mori game that has a powerful impact despite only lasting 5 minutes. So these are some of my favorite moments in games, right? That have really stuck with me over the years. But most of these moments aren't defined by narrative for me. They're moments, moments of reflection, of epiphany, of catharsis. And they also aren't really defined by being in the zone of, fun, balanced gameplay, which is typically what we talk about when we talk about gameplay. And I'll get to that in a little bit. But all these moments seem to kind of define a restricted interaction design framework, right? With good story on one side and fun gameplay on the other side. And the second problem I have with being trapped on a good story, fun gameplay framework, right, is that the games I most want to make don't seem to fit into this framework very well. So for example, I want to make a game about the little moment of fleeting beauty, right, and existential longing that I had on my last day teaching at a countryside middle school, standing here on this fall day, looking out at this empty soccer field, right? How do I make a game about that? I want to make a game about the irony and tragedy of a bridge called Freedom Bridge, which spans the Imjin River in the Korean demilitarized zone, which, despite its hopeful name, separates families, right? And that, can't be crossed from either side by anyone. I want to make a game that captures something of what it feels like to walk through the Chungek killing fields of Cambodia and all of the overwhelming emotions that are stirred up. I want to make a game about the inexplicable sacredness found in the mundane task of caring for the gravesite of a deceased loved one. I want to make a game about what it feels like to experience crushing loneliness. And on the other side, I want to make a game about the wonder of encountering strangers in a strange land who would take me into their home and treat me like family. I want to make a game about, what it feels like to watch my young children explore the world for the first time. And all of these games I want to make, and all of them games that I actually have made in this case, or attempted to make, right, involve a desire to explore complex emotions and meaning found in the little moments all around us that don't necessarily cohere to a nice narrative arc, right? And likewise, that don't necessarily lend themselves to notions of fun, balanced gameplay. So going back to the adapted poetry quotes, poetry is a lens that I found to be helpful for getting away from this story gameplay dichotomy. And it's a lens that I haven't seen people talk about very much in the worlds of game design or interaction design. So consider that poetry is often intimate and personal. It's often about expressing or exploring difficult topics and complex emotions. It's often about exploring meaning in the moments and in the loose ends that don't necessarily have a nice narrative arc. And it's about slowing down, giving pause, prompting reflection, right? In many ways, this list describes my favorite moments in games and also the kinds of games I want to make. So I want to suggest that we can make better games by crafting better stories and better gameplay. Absolutely, right? These are really important, crucial parts of video games, but also maybe by making better poetry, right? And that poetry can help us get away from thinking about interactive media too narrowly in terms of narrative design and gameplay design, which might not be the best approach if we want to do things like design for complex emotions or handle difficult topics in a resonant way. So how do we do this, right? How do we make games that are intimate and personal, right? Make games that express or explore difficult topics and complex emotions. Make games that explore meaning in the moments and in the loose ends of life that don't necessarily have a nice narrative arc. Make games that give pause, prompt reflection. Well, if our end goal is similar to poetry, right, in some cases, then maybe we should sometimes consider the process and techniques of poetry as one potential set of tools when designing interactive experiences, right? In other words, what we're asking here is, how does one go about writing good poetry, and how can we relate that process to games, right? And I've got 5 points basically that I would like to share briefly in this regard, how to do this. So point number 1, first point, try stripping away everything that's not essential. So this is something that renowned poets and critics talk about again and again. Marilyn Robinson says, one of the things I love about Emily Dickinson, the poet, is the extreme compression of her poems, which strip away everything inessential, greatly magnifying the potency of each individual word. So this is about asking what your game or a particular moment in your game or your interactive experience is about, then getting rid of everything that's not about that, right? This isn't a new idea, a novel idea, but I think one of the biggest things standing in the way of many video games, for example, having the impact they want to have is simply that they're too bloated, too watered down. So on a basic level, the reason Passage works is very simple, right? It works because it says, hey, this is a game about death, a memento mori, the title, the music, etc., right? And then it is, right? You can move around, you can explore with your partner, right? There's no insert coin to try again, and nothing to distract from the central essence of the game as this pure kind of reminder about death. In loneliness, I took the simplifying rule to the extreme by abstracting all imagery and representation, right? All that's left is the mechanical essence of a game exploring one emotion. Likewise, Freedom Bridge, another one of my games, right, is stark and minimalistic to emphasize the interaction. There's not a need for realistic graphics in this case, right? They would just distract from the central meaning that I'm trying to explore, the emotions I'm trying to evoke. And you may say, well, that's fine and well for tiny little games like Passage or Loneliness, but you can see this rule at work in games like Shadow of the Colossus as well, right? The austerity and beauty of the moment reflected in the simple, austere gameplay that's free from all distraction. Ride through the landscape, jump on the creature, climb, hold on, pierce, right? And the puzzle you're solving in this case isn't arbitrary. It's the puzzle of how to destroy this ancient being. And Shadow of the Colossus is in many ways short and to the point, right? I think you can play through the whole game in something like 10 hours, where mini games are just far too long and drawn out. So point number 2, consider long established poetic devices: alliteration, rhythm, imagery, turning of the line, metaphor, rhyme, symbolism. The question is, how can some of these things transfer to games? And the answer has to do with the point of these devices in poetry, which is to draw attention, prompt reflection, layer and heighten meaning. So in Loneliness and many of my other games, I use explicit symbolism, right, which you can see just by looking at the screenshot. And that's not because I'm too lazy to create better graphics. I've done, I sometimes work in different graphical styles. I've done 3D modeling in the past. I've made some 3D games, a VR game, right? But it's because explicit symbolism in this case actually gets the player into a frame of mind where they're thinking there's layered meaning and intentionality here, right? There's more than meets the eye. And in Brothers, for example, we can think of sitting on the bench as a kind of line break, right? So they have these benches scattered around the world throughout the game, right? And they create a kind of, they disrupt the rhythm of the game, right? It creates space, a moment to pause, a moment to appreciate what's going on and to realize again that there's intentionality here. Someone is crafting this, right? Pay attention. In Super Metroid, we can think of these save points as kind of rhyming throughout the game, right? They all operate the same way throughout the game at different points, right? So it creates this kind of rhyme. And then here at this point, the rhyme breaks. And it's startling, it's jarring. And again, it draws attention to the craft that's at work. It forces you to reconsider how you think about this game and maybe how you think about gameplay in general. When making another game that I've made, The Killer, this one touches again on the Chungak killing fields in Cambodia. I thought a lot about pacing, rhythm, turning of the line, right? So in this game, there's a long, long march, then a sudden single moment of decision, right? So again, I'm trying to prompt reflection, draw attention, wake the player up with this structure. And I found that the kinds of questions I'm asking constantly as I'm making my games are questions of poetics. Questions like, what is the best mechanic to use at a particular place in the game and why, right? How does the rhythm of a certain string of inputs create an effect that complements and heightens the game's theme? Or what kind of symbolism would be most effective here and why? Or where should the interactive flow break? So one last example from another of my games, When Gold is in the Mountain. So this game, which is sort of a digging simulator about the quest for gold, right, utilizes a similar basic structure to The Killer, right? But rather than holding down a button to walk, which is what you do in The Killer, right, which is an input scheme designed to invoke stillness and prompt reflection, right? The player of this game, When Gold is in the Mountain, they have to press the main input button multiple times on their controller just to complete a single dig cycle with their shovel, right? So this results in a relentless and futile pounding of the controller designed to invoke the themes of invasion and insatiability at play in this game. I experimented with using multiple different buttons to activate the dig cycle rather than a single button. So for example, like ABX, 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 something like that, right? But I found that such a scheme resulted in an input rhythm that felt more like a dance or a song. And I wanted something that evoked the pounding of a piston or a drill, right? So that's why I went back to that, just the one button over and over and over, right? So the question of how to map inputs in games like these and how that mapping impacts the felt experience of the player is not an afterthought for me, but a central concern that I see as deeply connected to lyric poetics and the historical use of poetic devices. Point number 3 is leave room for ambiguity. So here's a quote from philosopher and poet Alan Watts. He says, "A true haiku is a pebble thrown into the pool of the listener's mind, evoking associations out of the richness of his own memory. It invites the listener to participate." And there's an interesting connection here with games, actually, because Watts says invites the listener to participate. And of course, games are naturally interactive and participatory. So, we have this question of, are games a natural poetic form? I'd say maybe they are. So getting back to this idea of ambiguity, one of the reasons that something like Shadow of the Colossus is resonant is that it doesn't really tell you how to respond to what you are observing and taking part in. Right? A lot of games are much less ambiguous, and this is part of what can make some games feel a little bit boring or a little bit shallow, right? They just tell a story where you're a good guy taking out the bad guy, et cetera, right? And there's kind of there's kind of a unnatural simplicity there. Limbo is another example here where it's fascinating and memorable because there's all this symbolism in there and so much to think about, right? And none of it is fully explained by the game. Umberto Eco, here's another quote that I think is relevant for this idea of ambiguity. He says that poetic effect is the capacity that a text displays for continuing to generate different readings without ever being completely consumed. Right. So this idea that you can come back to a poem time and time again, many people can come back to it time and time again and keep thinking about new meanings, new ways to read it, et cetera, right? Which is that kind of that ambiguous quality, right? And that's what Limbo offers us as well, right? As we consider our experience and compare, for example, the game's end screen to the title screen, there's this really interesting comparison here when you get to the very end of the game, compared to the title screen at the very beginning. And this comparison, it just leaves room for a myriad of different readings, different interpretations, different considerations of what this game means, what it's about. People have discussed it for length, on places like Reddit. And that's part of the richness of the game there, really, is the fact that it doesn't spell everything out for you. It leaves room for these interpretations. Or, think about why Passage resonates for so many people who play it, right? The game doesn't preach or tell you what to think about death. It presents, which is an approach I take also in my game Grandmother as well, right? Is this a game about a mundane chore? So this is the game where, you're caring for the gravesite of a deceased loved one, right? Is it a game about a mundane chore, or is it a sacred encounter, or both, right? That's a question I leave for the player to ponder for themselves in this game. Okay, so point number 4, don't force balanced and fun gameplay. So again, here we have these points for making video games that tap into the power of poetry. Don't force balanced and fun gameplay. I've mentioned a few times now things not being about gameplay. But of course, every game, every interactive experience in some way really generally has some sort of gameplay in the sense of mechanics, dynamics, interaction. Right, but the problem with the gameplay and of the gameplay story spectrum, right, is that we often talk about good gameplay strictly in terms of what is balanced and fun, or a certain idea of fun, right? And that's not the only way good gameplay can work. And it may not be the best way to approach gameplay if we are interested in things like exploring complex emotions, or not all the time, right? I think you can have a lot of different kinds of gameplay in the same game, for example, right? So this isn't to say don't make fun video games, right? But I think that if we want to explore the full spectrum, the full possibility space of video games, it's useful to think about individual moments of gameplay, individual moments in the game, some of which maybe aren't about fun gameplay in a traditional sense. And something I've found to be true consistently in my own work, making the games I make, is that poetic goals are sometimes not compatible with goals of kind of traditional gameplay. And to illustrate my point, I want to talk briefly about Monopoly, actually, the well-known tabletop board game. So there's a game design framework called MDA, which stands for Mechanics, Dynamics, Aesthetics. So it's a framework, a way to understand game design. And it's a great framework in a lot of ways. I'd recommend checking it out if you're interested in game design, right? And it's very brief. The original paper where they discuss this framework, where the authors lay it out, it's maybe like 2 pages, right? So it's very easy to get your head around. It's a great way to think about game design. But in the original MDA paper where they discuss this framework, the authors talk about monopoly and the problem of rich players getting constantly richer and poor players getting constantly poorer. So they write, using our understanding of aesthetics and dynamics, we can imagine ways to fix monopoly, either rewarding players who are behind to keep them within a reasonable distance of the leaders, or making progress more difficult for rich players. Of course, this might impact the game's ability to recreate the reality of monopoly practices, but reality isn't always fun. And they then go on to explain, right, how to fix monopoly in order to make it more balanced and fun. Seems simple enough. But the interesting thing about monopoly is that it was actually originally designed by a woman named Elizabeth Maggie in 1903 as the Landlord's Game was the original name of it, right? And it was originally designed to illustrate the economic consequences of capitalism, namely that the rich tend to get richer and the poor tend to get poorer. So it was a kind of critique of capitalism. So we have to decide what the point is here. Is Monopoly a game to play for social bonding and enjoyment and a kind of traditional fun, right? Or is it a game about the brokenness of capitalism and the capitalist system? And it can't really be both at the same time, at least not fun in the traditional sense, right? Because the brokenness of capitalism is not fun, right? So we can imagine fixing Monopoly to make it more fun, a more kind of fun, traditional fun board game. And that's a classic game design challenge, which is what the MDA paper is about. Or we can imagine fixing the game to bring out what we might call its rhetorical and poetic intent. Oh, there's the other part, right? Is it social bonding and enjoyment or brokenness of capitalism, right? What's the game about? What do we want to bring out in it? What do we want to fix? Right, so fixing the game for fun to make it a more kind of just traditional fun game is a fine design goal. I think that's a fine goal, a fine, interesting thing to do, an interesting game design challenge, right? But my point is that it's also the assumed design goal, right? That the idea of poetic intent is often ignored when we discuss, what good gameplay means. So the problem with Monopoly from a poetic standpoint is not that the game isn't fun, right? The problem is that there are few moments of poetic resonance which allow players to appreciate its message. The game is far too long and drawn out and too bloated, and the rhythm is also too consistent, too monotone to really prompt reflection in the players. Right? There are certain moments when we're on the verge of appreciating Monopoly's poetic potential, right? Like when we land on a hotel after getting poorer and poorer throughout the game, right, and finally go bankrupt, right? Or when the already rich player lands on free parking and pulls in all the cash and loot, right? But rather than resonating or prompting reflection, these moments are typically lost in frustration because the game has become this long, drawn-out game of competition. Right? Monopoly may only be a couple of steps away from being a powerful poetic experience about the brokenness of capitalism. But it's not going to get there if our design goals only focus on traditional fun, balanced gameplay. Which isn't to say that the game couldn't be also poetic and fun in some sense to play, even as it demonstrates the brokenness of capitalism, right? But it might not be fun in exactly the traditional sort of way, the way we tend to kind of think about fun in a limited fashion of what traditional gameplay and traditional fun mean. So that brings us to my final point, which is if we want to make interactive experiences that might be considered poetic or that tap into the power of poetry, I think we need to respect the poetic process. When I hear people talk about how to do things like design for complex emotions, for example, it's usually either in the context of narrative design, right? Or it's an academic approach that privileges theory over practice. But I don't think there are many poets, if any, who would privilege theory over practice or say that their process isn't important. So this is a quote that I love from American poet Kathleen Norris. She says, "Once when I was asked, what is the main thing a poet does? I was inspired to answer, we wait." So what is the main thing a poet does? We wait. So over and over again, poets speak of waiting, watching, paying attention, the work before the work, the journey, whatever you want to call it. And speaking personally, most of the games I've ever made have attempted to explore, difficult topics or complex emotions in one way or another, have attempted to tap into kind of this resonant feeling of poetry. And I've never made a game that didn't require a lot of waiting, which for me often just looks like, going on a very long walk, or maybe 5 or 10. In fact, for any given game that I'm working on, I usually spend at least twice as much time waiting as I do making the game itself, right? And I usually consider the hard part of the game making process to be over once I can actually sit down and start crafting something, start programming on my computer. And now I'm not saying that I'm a great game maker or a great poet. I'm neither one of those things, right? I'm a dabbler, I am a doodler, I'm an experimenter, but just dabbling and attempting to make these kinds of games, I find requires a lot of patience and a respect for process. So to back up to where we started and reiterate, I think, of course, video games absolutely benefit from fun gameplay, and I think they absolutely benefit from good storytelling. But I think they can also relate to a whole lot of other things. And poetry is just one example of that, right? So rather than thinking about video games as being on some kind of limited continuum like this, I think it's more fruitful to think of video games as complex artifacts that involve the overlap of many complex categories, none of which have hard boundaries. Something more like this. So I'm certainly not going to say that poetry is the only lens or even the best lens necessary to use to think about game design. But I do think that if we want to make layered games that explore a variety of complex emotions in meaningful ways and that resonate uniquely with players, I think we could do a lot worse than look to poetry for inspiration. On the other hand, right, maybe you leave today thinking video games and poetry, I don't get it, I don't buy it. And that's fine. But I encourage you to find your own lenses and to not get stuck thinking about video games or other forms of interactive media in one way, right? Because if you get stuck thinking that video games are just games or they're just story machines, that's going to limit the ways that you look to understand and appreciate them. And it's also going to limit the kinds of video games that you make. And I think that would be a real shame. So anyway, food for thought. I'll end with this quote from Polish poet and Nobel laureate Czesław Miłosz, which for me sort of sums up why I think poetry has relevance for just about any game designer or interaction designer. Czesław says, "I have defined poetry as a passionate pursuit of the real." I have defined poetry as a passionate pursuit of the real. And I'll end my talk there and open things up for, I think we maybe have some time for some questions or a little bit of conversation. Thank you very much for listening. Is everyone still there? I can't see anyone or hear anyone. I don't know if.
Okay.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, sorry, I forget.
Okay, how you can translate metaphors into video game mechanics?
Here, let me just a moment here. I'm going to try to put on my headphones as well. I think this will help my ability to hear better here. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, again, how can you translate metaphors into video games mechanics?
Metaphors into video games mechanics. Yeah, that's an excellent question. A great question. Yeah, metaphor is an intriguing. I think metaphor is definitely a really important part of what makes poetry powerful. And it connects, I think, to this idea a little bit of the ambiguity of poetry, the power of the ambiguity, right? Because with metaphor, we're looking to kind of explore meaning by this comparison, right? Of you compare one thing to another thing, the basic definition of metaphor, and you let the player kind of establish new meaning, or you let new meaning come out by this comparison, right? That's not necessarily that's usually somewhat ambiguous, right? Because it's not just a statement of like an obvious thing, right? It's something that you're comparing and letting the player explore. So how to do that with game mechanics? I think, yeah, I mean, this is something I think a lot about. I think this is a super. I'm just thinking through here because it's such a great question, and one that I think we could probably talk about for an hour, just that question, So I'm trying to think of how to kind of answer this succinctly, or what to talk about, because that's such a great topic. One of the things I think about a lot in my games is this idea of how do you explore meanings through metaphor. You could see in my game like Loneliness, which I played a brief clip there, right? It's very much my attempt there was to ask this question of kind of like, okay, how can you explore through basic mechanics, basic interactions, basic representation, something like an emotion like loneliness, right? And one of the things I think about in that process basically is like you need to think like game mechanics aren't they don't exist sort of in a vacuum by themselves, right? They exist in the context of all the history of video games, all the video games that have used certain mechanics up to a point, right? So mechanics start to kind of tend to mean something over time based on the context they've been used in. And one thing that I like to do is try to find maybe new ways to use mechanics, or to question the traditional use of mechanics a little bit, to set up kind of a new question or new comparison for the player. So, for example, like in my game Loneliness, right? Like we have, if you just think about even just like the idea of avatar movement, right? So you have an avatar that you move like with a game controller or with the arrow keys on your keyboard. Right. And traditionally, that has been a metaphor in video games for spatial movement, right? For a body moving through space in some way, right? Maybe a spaceship moving through space, maybe a person walking over the ground, right? Or walking through a house, right? And I wanted to explore this idea of, can we use that? Can we kind of reframe that basic mechanic in a way that's not talking actually, that's not about a physical body moving through physical space, but is actually about the subjective interior experience of somebody, right? So in my game Loneliness, it's not about somebody walking through, it's not about someone walking outside, through the neighborhood, coming across groups of people who all run away from them, right? It's about this subjective experience of maybe memories or projections, what you imagine, what you remember, someone imagines having remembered, what they project into the future, right? But it's not clearly mapped to this physical body thing, right? And so I think reinterpreting mechanics or using mechanics in novel ways like that can be really interesting. And then the question of the metaphor and the meaning is like, this is where it's like, it gets very complex in terms of how can you ground that? How can you try to explore new kinds of metaphors or new kinds of meanings with basic game mechanics? And usually you need to give the player some ability to tap into that new meaning, right? So for Loneliness, for example, I use the highly symbolic characters, right, help with that, like just using the squares, right? Because suddenly now you're thinking, okay, you're in this more symbolic space, which leads naturally into the interior experience. And the title of the game, I think is actually very important, right? It's like I titled the game Loneliness very intentionally so that the player can come into it with a different, with a certain frame of mind and interpret the mechanics in that frame, right? So they're thinking about, right, if I called the game scary zombie guy, right? It could have a whole different kind of, you're set up to have a different kind of interpretation of the mechanics that you're exploring, right? So I think the grounding is also important. But yeah, sorry, this is a topic that we could talk about, I think, for a long, long time. It's a great topic. It is something that I discuss a bit in my book. Again, if you want to check that out at all. And there's some other great books that discuss this as well. One recent one that I would recommend is How Pac-Man Eats by Noah Wardrop-Fruin, a really excellent book that explores this question of like mechanics, metaphors through mechanics. But yeah, great question and very relevant to this topic. Thank you.
Okay, I have another one. Can I use this sort of idea or way of thinking, say if I'm already in the middle of a production of the development itself, or do I need to rethink my game from the beginning to use it?
Let's see. Sorry. Let me make sure. I'm having a little bit of a hard time hearing just because of echo in the room.
Okay. The question was if it is necessary to restart a production, or you can change your mindset and your concept in the middle of production to make something more poetic.
Right. Okay. That's the part of it. Okay. Yeah. I just missed that little part at the end. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think there's always room, right? As long when you're working on something, as long as it's in process still, I think there's certainly always room to kind of be reconsidering things, to be adapting things, right? I mean, some games that I make, I start them out one way and they end up, maybe being finished 3 years later, looking very different or whatever, right? So I think there's definitely, of course, where you are in the production process, how finished something is, and everything else comes into play. But I think there's definitely room to explore poetic meaning, in the midst of a project, maybe that's even not very poetic necessarily, but kind of bringing in, because a lot of the stuff, right? A lot of the games I make are very much kind of like, what I talk about in my book, they're kind of like what I think of as like game poems, right? They're very small, they're very expressive. It's very easy to compare them to poetry. But I'm also very interested, right, in how, and some of the things I talked about today, right, in how like poetry can kind of help us maybe consider moments or design powerful moments, even in other kinds of experiences, other kinds of games that aren't necessarily, they're maybe not poems, but that it can help kind of craft and make a certain moment really resonant or powerful. And so that's where I think, yeah, there's always room for that. I think, even if you're in the middle of something, to kind of step back maybe and say, is there anything here? Is there any aspect of this project? Is there any moment that's any critical moment that I want the player to have at a certain point in this game? Is it resonating in the way I want it to? Is there anything in poetry that could kind of help me here to maybe bring that moment out? So yeah, I think definitely it's something that you can apply kind of all along the way, wherever you are. But yeah, great question.
If you came the next year to Mexico, that's the other question that I have.
Sorry?
If you have time the next year to come to Mexico, that's the other
question. Time to come to Mexico. I would love to. Yes,
yeah.
I would love. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person there today, because that would be wonderful.
Yeah, we understand this week is difficult for the North American guest. Don't worry. Because of time, we can make another session, another month. Okay.
I would like to ask something. How is likely to make a livelihood of making games based on poetry? I'm thinking they won't sell to Ludo, right? So, because it's a lot about introspection, I think. So many people don't really like those kind of games. So I'm just asking, so it's like making these kind of games you should make them more like for yourself and trying to share them, or like you can actually live off them?
Yeah, no, great question. So if I'm understanding you correctly, you're kind of talking about sort of the practical aspect of like monetization and like making money, right?
Yep.
Is that what you're asking about? Kind of like just basically like how, is this something that that has practical applications for, say, commercial game design, that kind of thing? Am I right in how? Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And that's where it's like, I think there's a whole range, right, of kind of how that applies. So like for the small little games that I make, which often take 5 minutes to play through, and yeah, they're not sort of traditionally fun in a normal way. There's definitely not, right, these games don't rate. It's like I can't put those on the App Store really and charge a few dollars for them, probably. That's probably not going to work very well. I think for in that, for me, it's often it's kind of my art practice. The thing I do, kind of, it's not what's going to kind of be a commercial success for me or make me lots of money. I do think there are people, right, who are pursuing this kind of work, who are doing things like I don't know if you know of like Patreon or things like that, right? Or I did do a Kickstarter project I mentioned earlier, right? So I do think there are other avenues to tap into, people who are interested in this kind of work, to like, okay, how can I do this, say, for a living or something that like, but the other part of it is the question of how can poetry help us, say, take traditional whatever AAA games or what have you, mobile games, anything else, and are there aspects of poetry? So we're not talking about like, I'm not saying like, don't go out and make games that aren't fun or something, right? I think you can make fun traditional games, but where aspects of poetry might actually help the games work better, right? It might actually help them have a more powerful impact, might help them be more memorable to players. In which case, that sort of thing, I think, can, in that context, they can, it could be something that actually is helpful for commercialization, right? That can make a game, say, have better word of mouth, right? And more people be impacted by it, interested in it. Just a few games that come to mind, right? I mentioned like Shadow of the Colossus, right? I think that's a game that taps into the power of poetry, right? And it's often cited as one of people's favorite games, right? A game that gets passed down as one of the great games of history. Or games like, I think of a game like What Remains of Edith Finch. Has anyone played that? Any of you played What Remains of Edith Finch? It's a great game, but also a commercial success, a very commercial successful indie game, but that very much like has a lot of poetic elements in it, right? So I don't think there's one answer to that, right? I think it's all across the spectrum. I think if you're making small little games that like I do, that are just kind of little game poems, that are, kind of maybe a little weird or artistic, it's like, yeah, you're going to probably have to do something else if you want to monetize those, maybe a Patreon, maybe Kickstarter, something like that. But I think there's lots of room to bring some of the power and of poetry into traditional fun games that are just going to make those games better.
Another question: how can I dive into poetry if I haven't? If you mean my whole life I haven't been into it.
Sure. Yeah. How can you like how can get into poetry if it's not something that you're super familiar with? I think, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that is where, I think something like, I mean, my book might be a little helpful in that regard, because I don't assume people are in poetry. I just kind of talk about it from an introductory standpoint. I think there are some books out there. I'm not so much as familiar, and I apologize, with things that might be, original Spanish language works in this regard. But I know that, say, in terms of like English works, I know that we have like a number of poets have created, say, short poetry handbooks that are very kind of easy introductory texts of kind of like, what is poetry? How does poetry work? I think of one in particular that I really like, by Mary Oliver, who is a well-known American poet. She has one, just Mary Oliver Poetry Handbook. It's very short, very easy to read. It gives a great introduction. And I presume, I'm sure there are similar resources also. That book may be translated as well, and I'm sure there are similar resources both in English and Spanish. But I think, yeah, just doing a bit of searching in that regard, kind of introduction to poetry handbooks, and things, I think can be helpful for getting started thinking about some of these things. Yeah, great question.
¿Seguros? Okay, I have to thank you for the chance to talk with us. I'll see you later in the week because we are dying here. But thanks so much, and we hope to see you soon.
Yes, great. Well, thank you again. Thanks so much for having me. And yes, no, it's really lovely. And thanks for the great questions. I really enjoyed it. So best wishes, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.